Welcome to Buried Secrets, a podcast about the paranormal, the occult, and weird and forgotten history. I'm Chris. This episode is about a topic that I find endlessly fascinating and very funny, which is mythical creatures, in particular, mythical creatures as depicted in medieval bestiaries, which are like books of creatures both real and imaginary, though I think at the time they thought they were all real. So I'll get into some of the lore about famous ones like the basilisk, but I'm more interested in the weird ones that I've dug up. I probably will do a follow-up to this one because I only got through part of the list of bizarre, imaginary, medieval creatures that I have. But before I start talking weird creatures, I have a couple updates about cemetery visits I've been on lately. I, to be honest, haven't been reading much, so I don't really have any books to recommend or talk about, but I do have cemeteries to talk about. So a couple weeks ago, earlier this month, I had a day off, so I biked out to the cemetery belt. And specifically, I wanted to see Harry Houdini's grave. It's in an abandoned cemetery out in Glendale, or maybe Ridgewood. My phone and the map disagreed about where I was, but somewhere on the border between Glendale and Ridgewood. And I had kind of wandered a little more than I should have on my way there. There's just so many cemeteries there, and it's hard to walk by all these cool cemeteries and not go in. So I'd spent a while walking my bike around the perimeter of these huge masses of cemeteries just all squeezed next to each other. And I was like taking pictures through the fence and trying to see what I could without entering different cemeteries because, I really wanted to find Houdini's grave. And of course, as often happens with me, I lost track of time and I get to the area where the cemetery is supposed to be, but the gates to the cemetery are locked. They have basically like a chain and padlock, I think. You cannot get into the old abandoned cemetery, which makes sense. And I had read online that you can't get in through the main entrance anymore. So I went around and there's a number of cemeteries that border it, including the Hungarian Cemetery and Union Field Cemetery. And I tried to get to it through the Hungarian Cemetery, but kind of where the two cemeteries bordered, there was a low fence and also there were some people working, like cemetery staff, and I felt a little self-conscious carrying my bike all the way out to the edge of the cemetery and stepping over a low fence to get to the abandoned cemetery. And also, it was kind of unclear from a distance how low that fence really was and whether you could get from one cemetery to the other. So I was like, okay, there's another cemetery next door that I read online you can definitely get to Houdini's grave from. And of course, like many cemeteries in New York, part of the path to the other cemetery, to Union Field Cemetery, was not paved and there was trash dumped everywhere. So at one point I was basically climbing over huge piles of trash and like logs and stuff, carrying my bike, trying to get into this other cemetery. So not the easiest place to get to. So I finally get to Union Field Cemetery, try to go through that, and I realize I have about 30 minutes before the cemetery closes, and very ominously, there's a sign that says, cemetery gates close at whatever it was, 3:45 or 4. Very ominous. There's no one else in the cemetery. It was kind of like drizzly and overcast, very creepy. It's a really beautiful cemetery. If you live in the area, I definitely recommend that you check out Union Field Cemetery. So I had Google Maps up. I was looking at the point indicating where Houdini's grave was, and I was kind of zigzagging through these rows of monuments and climbing down stairs that were falling apart. And as I got to the part where, retaining walls were falling apart, stairs were crumbling underneath me, I was like, okay, I think I'm in the abandoned cemetery now. And I was. And at this point, I'm basically speed walking, trying to get to Houdini's grave before the cemetery gates are locked, which feels like a very characteristic problem for me to have. And luckily, I got to the grave pretty quickly. And of course, the grave is right next to the main entrance of this abandoned cemetery, which I mispronounce the name every time I say it, but it's Machpelah or something like that. Machpelah Cemetery. But, of course the gates are locked, so you have to go through this really circuitous route to find Houdini's grave. And it's really cool. I posted some pictures on the show's Instagram, which is Buried Secrets Podcast on Instagram, but there's sort of this big white, I guess, U-shaped monument kind of enclosing part of the gravesite. And there's this statue of a woman weeping. There's a bust of Houdini, which I know has been repeatedly stolen and destroyed over the years, and it's been replaced a bunch of times. There are the grave sites of Houdini and his mother and other members of his family. And one really cool thing is that people left, I guess, sort of like offerings, or they left things at the gravesite. So there were decks of cards and handcuffs and all sorts of magical or like magician accoutrement. There were coins. There was a Rubik's Cube. There was all kinds of cool stuff. So it was a really cool place to visit. I wish I could have spent more time there. But if you're in the New York area and like cemeteries, I really recommend checking it out, especially because the cemeteries near it are so beautiful. And also, there's just something, if you love cemeteries, there's something to be said for standing in a cemetery and you're just surrounded by all these other cemeteries. Like across the street, there's cemeteries. There's cemeteries next to the cemeteries. It's unbelievable how many there are. Even though I had looked at the map beforehand, but just kind of biking past cemetery after cemetery, it's really a trip. So I might end up doing an episode someday about Houdini's grave and kind of about Houdini. There's a lot of interesting stories there, but I did want to talk about my visit to his grave. Oh, and by the way, you can get to his grave going through the Hungarian cemetery. So if you attempt to visit it, just go through the Hungarian cemetery, head straight back toward the low fence, and there's a part that you can just step over. Don't try going through Union Field, I would say, just because it's not paved over there and it's kind of annoying to walk through. So that's the first cool cemetery I've visited lately. And then the second cemetery is actually Moore Jackson Cemetery. So that was the topic of the last episode. It's a cool local cemetery. It's a colonial cemetery that's been turned into a community garden. And I had the opportunity last week, I guess, to volunteer and help out a little bit there. And it was really cool. It's a really beautiful space. Like, I had only ever seen it from the street, but they have garden beds of flowers. They're working on growing vegetables and that sort of thing. Like, they're prepping garden beds for that. But it's a really cool space. If you live in Western Queens, I definitely recommend checking it out. And if you go to morejacksonnyc.org, you can sign up to volunteer there. I really recommend it. It was really cool to actually be inside the cemetery and get to check that out, but also it was fun doing a bit of yard work there. And actually, I was talking to some of the people who run it and was told some really interesting stuff about its history that I hadn't read before. So I want to dig a little deeper into that and hopefully do a follow-up episode sometime, doing a bit of a deeper dive about Moore Jackson Cemetery, because they had some really interesting stories. So I know this is the first episode in a long time that's not about cemeteries. However, I still somehow managed to talk about cemeteries for a while, so you're welcome or I'm sorry. But let's get to the topic of today's episode, which is weird, legendary, medieval creatures. So this is sort of just a fun episode that I wanted to do. I am really into medieval stuff. I don't know that I've talked about this that much here in the podcast. I've definitely posted some stuff on Instagram about how I'm into medieval things. But in college, I took a whole semester that was just medieval stuff. So like medieval history, theology, art, and literature. Though I think I've probably forgotten most of that. However, I am still into medieval stuff. I find it really interesting. And I've said this before, but I'm not an expert on anything, really. So I can't give a huge amount of historical context, even though theoretically it has been taught to me. I guess it's stored away somewhere in a part of my brain that I can't access, but I'll give whatever context I can give. Though to be honest, I just love looking at old medieval bestiaries, and I also like looking at old books of hours, which often have cool medieval illuminations on the side with a lot of weird creatures and plants and things. And you'll just see bizarre stuff. You'll see like a person's face attached to like chicken legs running up a vine or whatever. Like medieval manuscripts have so much random stuff, and I find them hilarious. And I guess now I think of it, I have multiple tattoos of weird medieval creatures that I found funny. So I guess it's something I'm really into, even though I haven't really talked about a lot of medieval stuff on the podcast. Another medieval thing I'm really into is the cloisters, which is a branch of the Met Museum here in New York. It's maybe my favorite museum. It's in Upper Manhattan and Inwood, in the middle of a really cool park with a view of the New Jersey Palisades and the Hudson River, and it's basically just a big medieval cloister full of tapestries, stained glass, and other medieval art and artifacts. And it's really immersive. So the cloister was brought over from Europe, and they have medieval-type plants growing everywhere, including an actual garden of magical plants, right? Like plants believed to have different magical properties, and they also have gardens of plants that were used for different purposes back then. So like they have like a madder plant for dyeing things red and that sort of thing. It's a really cool place. If you live even remotely close to New York City, I really recommend it. And pre-pandemic, they had things like an annual Renaissance festival in the park next to the cloisters. I went there one year. There was jousting and stuff. It was very fun. But the thing that the Met Cloisters is best known for is a tapestry of a unicorn. You've almost certainly seen it. It's like a unicorn in captivity. So it's famous for a depiction of a legendary creature. So very on topic for this episode. So while my knowledge of actual medieval history is iffy, I have a lot of enthusiasm for medieval stuff. And I spend a lot of time, many hours, unwinding by going through scans of medieval manuscripts online and just looking at them and trying to find weird animals. So, we all have our hobbies, and this one I would like to share with you. Oh, and before we get into the creatures, if you, like me, love looking at old medieval manuscripts online, I highly recommend that you Google Black Books of Hours, because there are some medieval manuscripts where they dyed the vellum, so that's like the material the paper was made out of. They dyed it black before illuminating, like illustrating them. And there aren't many of them. I think there's only 7 Black Books of Hours left that are still around, but they look so cool. Unfortunately, I guess the ink they used to dye them was really corrosive, so the surviving manuscripts are in bad shape, but still, they're wild looking. Google them if you're into that. So let's get to the creatures. The main source that I used here is a website called bestiary.ca, which lists a bunch of creatures and has information about each one. If you're into bestiaries or medieval creatures, medieval beasts, I recommend checking out that website. And basically, the other day, I went through their alphabetized list of medieval beasts, and it's delightful because each one has a one-line description of each critter, which is very funny to me because some of them are real animals and the description is hilarious, at least to me. So as I talk about these animals, I'll also give the one-line description. But just to give you a sense of the absurdity of some of the descriptions of real animals, there are listings like badger, a dirty beast that bites, or bee. Bees are the smallest of birds and are born from the bodies of oxen. Or cuckoo, a weak bird that travels on the backs of kites. Kites are another type of bird. So it's all very silly. So the first creature I want to talk about is the seps. The description of the seps on bestiary.ca is, The poison of the seps consumes both body and bones. So the illustration that accompanies it on bestiary.ca looks like a snake with a cat head, or maybe a mean-looking bunny head. So of course this is an imaginary creature, it doesn't actually exist, but basically this was a tiny snake with a lot of power. It was very deadly when it bit you, and its poison could literally dissolve your body and bones. There's this amazing description from a Roman poet named Marcus Annaeus Lucanus, or Lucan, which I wanted to read. Clinging to his skin, a seps with curving tooth of little size, he seized and tore away, and to the sands pierced with his javelin. Small the serpent's bulk, none deals a death more horrible in form. For swift the flesh dissolving round the wound, bared the pale bone, swam all his limbs in blood, wasted the tissue of his calves and knees, and all the muscles of his thighs were thawed in black distilment and file membrane sheath, parted that bound his vitals, which abroad flowed upon earth, yet it seemed that not all his frame was loosed, for by the venomous drop were all the bands that held his muscles drawn, down to a juice, the framework of his chest was bare, its cavity, and all the parts, hid by the organs of life that make the man. So, I just found that description delightful, very metal, very fun. So that's the seps. There are a number of snake-type creatures I'm going to be talking about. So the next one is another imaginary serpent called the Skytalus. So the description here is a serpent with such a marvelous appearance that it stuns the viewer. So this reminded me a little bit of a basilisk, which has the ability to stun people. But the idea here is that the Skytalus has these beautiful and strange markings that run across its back, and people are transfixed by these intricate markings. So even though the Skytalus was supposed to be very slow moving, it just relied on people being stupefied so it could get them. Which, to be honest, that sounds very silly, yet also, if this creature exists, I could see that working on me. I definitely, when I was in North Carolina last year, would be like in the woods and I'd find a snake and I'd watch it for a while, so the Skytalus would definitely have gotten me if it existed and was in the woods. Also, apparently this was a very warm-blooded snake, so even during the winter it had to shed its skin, which is very funny because, of course, reptiles are cold-blooded. Anyway, the next creature is the Wether, Wether. So the description of this made me crack up. The Wether is named from the worms in its head. So this was supposed to be like a stronger than average ram that headbutted other wethers because they were agitated by the worms in their head. So I guess the worms were itchy, so they would fight by headbutting each other, and that's what the Wether does. The accompanying drawing just looks like a normal ram to me, but I find it very funny. Like, of course, I'm sure different animals had different insects living on them. It's not so unusual that that would be a thing, but there was just something so funny to me about them describing a species of animal that, no, that animal just has worms in its head. Don't worry about it. So the next animal is the sea pig. So just the name of this made me laugh. The description is sea pigs dig up the ground underwater. So the drawing for this one is one of those classic medieval drawings that I love. It is like a fish with a pig snout. And the idea is that they are like regular pigs in that they use their snout to dig around in the sand to find food. They just did it underwater rather than on land. While this version of the sea pig is not real, there is an animal called a sea pig that's a deep water sea cucumber that digs around in the sediment and eats stuff that it finds in there. Though I doubt medieval people knew about this sea cucumber, since the real sea pig is found about 1,200 to 5,000 meters underwater. Though maybe the naming of the sea cucumber was inspired by the legendary creature. So the next one is another serpent. So this is a cerastes, which is an exceptionally flexible serpent with horns. So the cerastes was supposed to be so flexible that they had no spine, but they did have either 4 horns or 2 horns, kind of like a ram's. And the idea is that they would bury themselves in sand, and when animals would gather around the exposed horns, the cerastes would strike and kill them instantly. So this creature came from Greek lore, but even as late as the Renaissance, it seems like people were still talking about them. Here's how Leonardo da Vinci described their behavior. This has 4 movable little horns, so when it wants to feed, it hides under leaves all of its body except these little horns which, as they move, seem to the birds to be some small worms at play. Then they immediately sweep down to pick them, and the cerastes suddenly twines around them and encircles and devours them. In the drawing that accompanies this one on bestiary.ca, the cerastes has little front feet, which I find charming. This creature was said to reside in the desert, and they were supposed to be very small. The largest animals that they could attack were mice and small lizards. Nowadays, people suppose that this mythical creature was based on the real horned viper, which ended up with the scientific name Cerastes cerastes because of this legendary creature. The next one is a word that I have trouble pronouncing. Echinus, maybe? Echinus? It's spelled Echenneis. Someone who knows Greek can correct me. I assume that's Greek. So the description of this one is, this fish clings to ships and holds them back. The idea was that this fish was 6 inches long, it lived in the Indian Sea, and it could suction onto the bottom of a boat and delay its voyage. And even though this fish was only 6 inches long, it was very strong, and storm winds couldn't move a boat when this fish decided to anchor it in place. So I guess it was a magical fish. Pliny the Elder, who was a 1st century Roman naturalist, philosopher type guy, he always has funny things to say about animals, plants, and magic, and he talked about some of this fish's metaphysical properties. He wrote, "It is also the source of a love charm and a spell to slow litigation in courts, and can be used to stop fluxes of the womb in pregnant women and to hold back the birth until the proper time. This fish is not eaten. Some say this fish has feet. Aristotle says it does not, but that its limbs resemble wings." I'm going to be honest, when I had to take ancient philosophy in college, I struggled to follow it. But I don't remember Aristotle talking about weird animals. Maybe I would have had a more fun time if the stuff we were reading had information about whether or not fish have feet. Just a thought. So, to me, this creature seems obviously inspired by the real fish, the remora. And from what I can gather, it seems like Pliny the Elder uses remora and echinus interchangeably. Or maybe the translators use them interchangeably. Pliny the Elder told stories about how the remora was responsible for Mark Antony's death during battle, as well as Caligula's. This was a fish that could do a lot of damage. And the real fish, the remora, in case you aren't familiar with it, it has a sort of suction cup sort of thing on it, and it usually attaches to a shark or a sea turtle or a whale, and I think they're supposed to have sort of a symbiotic relationship, so they get rid of their host's dead skin and parasites and other things, and they're protected by being attached to these much larger animals. So this is a case where this fish has magical properties attributed to it that aren't real, but there is sort of a real version of this fish. So then the next one was one that I really liked the story of. The Hercynia, and this one was a bird with brightly glowing feathers. So this is my favorite kind of medieval creatures, a bird. I love birds, and there are a lot of weird medieval ones. So this was supposed to be found in the forests of Germany. Specifically, the Hercynia lived in an ancient German forest called the Hercynian Forest, hence the name. It was a huge forest that spread across Western Central Europe, and it's kind of unclear exactly how far it stretched. But basically, it was the northern edge of the part of Europe that writers in antiquity were aware of. And it sounds like this forest was basically impenetrable. For example, during Julius Caesar's time, the forest blocked the Roman legions from going further into Germania. And Caesar wrote in his book De Bello Gallico that it would take more than 60 days to walk the width of this forest. I guess that Julius Caesar was really fascinated by this forest, and apparently he really liked the old stories of unicorns there. So, Julius Caesar loves unicorns. He also wrote about other creatures, like he talked about an elk that had no joints, so they couldn't sit down or lay down, so to sleep they would have to lean against these huge ancient trees, which I find very fun. For some reason, I'm really charmed or intrigued by this idea of this ancient forest covering most of Europe. I think maybe to me it feels like something from a fantasy novel or something, but I guess I'm not the only person fascinated by this concept. So Pliny the Elder was really into this forest and its legends, and he talked about these glowing birds with feathers that, quote, shine like fires at night. The forest also contained real, though now extinct animals, like the aurochs. I'm sure I'm saying that's wrong, but it's spelled Aurochs. And these were huge cattle that lived in Asia and Europe and North America. They died out in the 1600s when the last of them died in those woods, I'm pretty sure. But it's kind of interesting that this forest of mythological creatures also housed real animals that are just no longer with us. So while this deep, dark forest doesn't exist anymore, there are some remnants of it, like the Black Forest and a bunch of other woods in the area. So to get back to the Hercynia, the idea was that the Hercynia was so bright that even on the darkest night, their glowing wings could light the way ahead. And some manuscripts adorned depictions of Hercynias with gold or silver leaf to indicate that they were shiny, which I think is a very nice touch. The 7th century writer Isidore of Seville wrote this really poetic description of the Hercynia. Their feathers sparkle so much in the shade, however dark the night is with thick shadows, these feathers, when placed on the ground, give off light that helps to mark the way, and the sign of the glittering feathers makes clear the direction of the path. I love that. Again, it sounds like something in a fantasy novel to me. I like it. I also found a poem by the 18th/19th century Irish poet Thomas Moore that had some cool glowing bird imagery. He wrote this poem called A Dream of Antiquity, and I wanted to read from that. And now the fairy pathway seemed to lead us through enchanted ground, where all that bard had ever dreamed of love or luxury bloomed around. Oh, 'twas a bright, bewildering scene among the alley's deepening green. Soft lamps that hung like burning flowers, and scented and illumed the bowers, seemed to him, who darkling roves among the lone Hercynian groves, appear those countless birds of light that sparkle in the leaves at night, and from their wings diffuse a ray along the traveler's weary way. So that poem really feeds into this romantic idea of this Hercynian forest. Even though I assume the forest was probably extremely treacherous, like if it kept back Roman armies, I'm sure it was a deadly, scary place to be, but it's hard not to romanticize an ancient forest, Apparently there's a question of whether the Hercynia, the creature, or a version of it ever existed. Because some birds have kind of iridescent feathers that can reflect the moonlight. It's also possible that people were seeing birds with bioluminescent fungi or bacteria. So maybe this legendary bird wasn't totally made up. So the next creature I want to talk about is one that I really can't pronounce. I'll say it's the Ichneumon. It's spelled Ichneumon. The description of this one is another enemy of the dragon. Apparently, dragons had lots of enemies. So this was a creature that, when it saw a dragon, would burrow into the mud and cover its nostrils with its tail. I don't know why. I don't know if that's to hide its breathing or what. And then it would attack and kill the unaware dragon. Some people also claim that it could kill asps, so snakes, poisonous snakes, and crocodiles in the same way. It sounds like maybe this was something like a mongoose, and one of the ichneumons' special powers was that it could look at this creature called the cockatrice without turning into stone. So let's talk about what a cockatrice is. The cockatrice seems to also be called the basilisk. It seems like the names are used somewhat interchangeably. So while bestiary.ca did not have a description of the cockatrice, it did have a description of the basilisk, which is its odor, voice, and even look can kill. So on that page, the basilisk is shown as a two-legged dragon with a rooster's head. Though in some depictions, it can just be a snake with a crest, or like a dragon with two legs and a more reptilian head with a crest. It doesn't necessarily need to have the rooster's head. It could also be a rooster with a snake tail. There's all sorts of ways to depict this. I know most people know what a basilisk is because of Harry Potter, but I think it would have been a lot funnier if in Harry Potter, the basilisk, instead of being a huge creepy snake, was a rooster with a snake's tail. Just an idea. So, Pliny the Elder said that the basilisk was about a foot long, though some people said it was 6 inches, so it's tiny. I always imagined it as being this huge thing, but apparently it was small, like some of the other snakes I'm talking about here. That struck me as really funny, because I don't know, I guess if I was making up this deadly snake, I would have imagined it as being this huge thing, like something big and scary, but no, it was just like a little tiny snake rooster thing that could just kill you all these different ways. Which, I don't know, maybe that is really scary. I think I would actually be afraid, now that I think of it, if I saw a rooster with a snake's tail or a snake with a rooster head and feet. At any rate, Pliny the Elder said that the basilisk had white markings on its head and it looked like a crown, and people kind of, in different places, referred to the basilisk as like the king of the snakes. So a human could be killed if the basilisk looked at them, or maybe if the human sees the basilisk's eyes, depending on who's telling the story. Pliny the Elder tells the story about the basilisk's poison being so strong that when a man speared a basilisk, he was killed when the poison traveled up the spear and then got to him. And then because he was touching his horse, because he was riding his horse, the poison killed the horse too. So a little 6-inch long creature, very deadly. Probably should just run away if you see one. Kind of like the rabbit in Monty Python. You just don't want to mess with it. The basilisk could also apparently kill just by hissing. So, extremely deadly. However, the basilisk did have a weak spot, which was that it could be killed by a weasel. So what you would do is you get the weasel, and then you find the den of the basilisk, and you throw the weasel into the basilisk's den, and then the basilisk is killed by the smell of the weasel, and at the same time, the weasel dies from the smell of the basilisk. I guess they both were supposed to smell bad, or were allergic to each other's scent. Who knows? So I just found that so funny, right? This creature that could kill a human by conveying its poison up their weapon, but could be killed by a little weasel. If you've ever been to Belvedere Castle in Central Park, there's supposedly a cockatrice in the window over the doorway of the castle, and I've noticed that before. But I always thought that looked like a wyvern, like a two-legged dragon, because I just imagine the cockatrice looking really silly, and the dragon at Belvedere Castle just looks like a serious dragon. So, all of this to say, the basilisk or the cockatrice appear in different places in art. I think the cockatrice especially was like a thing in England, though we've got one of everything in New York, so we've got this cockatrice supposedly at Belvedere Castle. So, some stories say that the basilisk was created when a rooster laid an egg, and then a toad incubated it. And, roosters obviously can't lay eggs. But there is this sort of type of egg called a cock egg or a yolkless egg, and it's basically just an egg with no yolk, and younger chickens sometimes lay it before they can lay normal eggs. But back in the day, because they weren't normal eggs, people assumed that the roosters were laying the egg, or the cocks were laying the egg, and so that's why they thought the cockatrice came from that. There was also an ancient Egyptian story about how the eggs of the ibis, which is, a type of bird, should be destroyed because otherwise the poison of the snakes that ibises ate would create a hybrid snake bird, kind of like the cockatrice. But in Europe, apparently, the way that you would prevent a cockatrice from hatching is by throwing the cock's egg, this yolkless egg, over the house so that it lands on the other side of the house without the egg hitting the house. And then it smashes on the other side of the house, and you've just saved yourself from certain death at the hands of the cockatrice. So, of course, like I mentioned, the cockatrice could kill people by looking at them, touching them, breathing on them. So, the cockatrice/basilisk was extremely deadly, not easily defeated, but while the living basilisk was very dangerous, supposedly the basilisk's ashes were supposed to be very useful in alchemy when transforming metals into other metals. So, I guess the only people looking for basilisks would be alchemists. Otherwise, I would say run away if you see one. Just like the bunny in Monty Python. Very small, but very dangerous. So, that's the list of creatures that I wanted to talk about today. I have a long list of medieval critters that I find very fun and funny, so I'll probably talk about this more another time. Let me know if you liked this. I know usually my episodes are a bit more narrative, but I just find these things too fun not to talk about. So I'll be back the week after next. But in the meantime, you can follow the show on Instagram at Buried Secrets Podcasts. You can check out the show notes with all the sources I used for this at buriedsecretspodcast.com. You can write to me at buriedsecretspodcast@gmail.com. If you like this episode, please tell your friends about it. Please rate and review on your podcatcher of choice, but especially Apple Podcasts. And thanks so much for listening.